Hello, Year 11. This is a video where I take you through the whole War in Asia course, so that's Korea and the war in Vietnam. It's not supposed to be a very detailed description of every aspect of the course, but it will give you a really good overview, and it might be a really good thing to watch just before the actual exam itself. So what I think is the way to use this video is not maybe to watch it all in one go, but to do it in sections. Korea, first part of Vietnam, second part of Vietnam, for example, and to use it in conjunction with the spider diagrams I've given you, because it breaks the course down into manageable chunks. That's what's really important about this video. Okay, so what are those chunks? Well, effectively the course breaks down into three parts, so it's worth thinking about your revision along these three parts first of all. So the first thing is the Korean War, the second is the conflict in Vietnam from 1945 up to 1968, and then the last bit is the Vietnam War from 68 to 75. So that's one way you can break down your revision. So if we start with the Korean War, again, what I think is really useful when it comes to revision is breaking the course down into manageable chunks that make sense. And in these chunks you see where the big sort of questions lie. So what are those three chunks to look at, or those three big questions I should say here for the Korean War? So the first one is, what were the causes of the Korean War? The second one is, how does the Korean War develop from 50 to 53? So what are the major events? And then the last one is, well, what were the consequences? Why was this significant? Okay, so you've basically got causes, events, and consequences. If you think about it in that way, that will make your revision much more straightforward. So let's start with causes then, and again, just bear in mind, I'm not spending a very long time on these, but I'm trying to give you a real sense of overview and something really to watch, just that, at the end, towards the end of the of your course, or at the beginning when you're trying to get an idea of where you're going. So, causes of the Korean War. Really important, clearly, to understand that this is part of a broader Cold War between the capitalist America and communist Soviet Union. And the Korean War has to be seen in that context. Remember, after the Second World War, these allies quickly, that alliance quickly breaks down as soon as they don't have a common enemy. And both sides want to spread their own political ideology, whether it be communism or democratic capitalism. Remember, Europe is the first continent to be divided between Eastern communist states and Western capitalist states. And by 48, really, Europe has been divided with the famous Iron Curtain down the middle, and then Asia becomes the focus, and the first big battleground, if you like, is Korea, where something very similar happens to Germany, because of course it is divided into two. Now, why does it become even more important? It's because, of course, China becomes a communist country in 1949, so now you have this huge communist bloc stretching from East Germany all the way to China. So America clearly worried about the spread of communism. Now, the third thing to bear in mind when you think about causes is that Korea is divided into two, a capitalist South and a communist North. Neither side is happy with this. This division is an artificial division and will ultimately lead to the North invading the South in June 1950. What Kim Il-sung is intending to do is to try to unite the country under his leadership with the support of Stalin and Mao. So those are the four things I would try to remember. You've got to be able to talk about the Cold War, this rivalry between the capitalist America, capitalist democratic America, and this communist dictatorship, the Soviet Union. And Korea is one battleground of many, if you like, in trying to spread their influence. The fact that China becomes communist is another big reason, because there is this confidence that communism is spreading. And thirdly, this division of Korea in the first place creates the conditions for the war. Okay, next then, events of the war. Well, the first thing to bear in mind is the North, of course, invades the South in June 1950, and first of all, they're much stronger army and bigger than the South, and they have a lot of success, and they push the Southern Army back to the southeast corner, known as the Pusan Pocket, by September. And without foreign intervention, it would appear that the South was doomed. But America, led by President Truman, is very keen to defend capitalism and democracy, having already promised to do so under the Truman Doctrine. And Truman goes to the United Nations and persuades them that they need to send a force to support the South. Now, they're able to do this because the Soviet Union is boycotting meetings of the Security Council in protest about China not being allowed onto it. And so the Americans are able to persuade the UN to support this force. So a UN force arrives, is largely American, but with many other countries involved, including the United Kingdom. And they arrive, and they arrive both in Busan and in a place called Incheon, which you can see on the map there. And things are turned around, and the Northern Army is pushed back across the border, and in fact right up to the Chinese border. Now, the Chinese threaten to, and then do, join the war as a result, and those extra troops help the Northern Army to push the Southern and the UN forces back to nearer the border. And what you have is a situation for 2 years that we might call stalemate. So neither side is able to make a huge advances, but there is an awful lot of fighting going on, and there's an awful lot of aerial bombardment and a lot of destruction, and many die, although neither gain a significant advantage. What are some of the things you want to think about? Remember, the Soviet Union and China are supporting the North with weapons, and in the end China, of course, send troops. Worth bearing in mind that MacArthur, who leads the UN forces, is sacked during the course of this war because of his because of the dangers that he appeared to pose, because he wanted a full-on war with China and was prepared to use nuclear weapons, and Truman wasn't prepared to do that. So this could have got a lot more serious. It doesn't, because Truman doesn't want this war to spill over into something bigger, because of course at this point the Soviet Union also has atomic weapons. So lots of it sort of swings backwards and forwards, but ultimately relates in a stalemate and a ceasefire, although never a permanent peace deal, and it's still a very dangerous border, is signed in 1953. Now, what are the consequences? Huge consequences in terms of loss of human life. Particularly Koreans, but also Chinese, and the problem of refugees that always results from war. Huge destruction of infrastructure in both North and South. Korea becomes permanently divided and remains divided to this day. There is a demilitarized zone, but this is a very highly militarized border and has remained so ever since, and is a tension even now for a potential Third World War. You could argue that in some ways the UN and the US position is strengthened by this, because they prevent the spread of communism, they contain it, which is what Truman had promised he was going to do. It's also clear to see that China is now, whether you would call it a superpower, but it certainly emerges as a very strong threat and force in the area. And fundamentally, this deepens the Cold War. It continues it helps to continue the arms race as both sides dig in, the Soviet Union and America, and look to increase their stock of nuclear weapons and conventional weapons. And in a sense, this is a precursor to the longer Vietnam War, where a similar situation will arise later on. So let's look now at Vietnam. So again, I'm going to tell you, breaking it down into the key questions is going to be really valuable when you come to think of a revision. So what are the key questions in this first bit? So the first bit is the kind of 20 years-ish from 45 to 68, okay? And there are 3 things or 4 things you want to consider here. One, how did the rule of the French, who were there before the Americans, lead to civil war? Civil war is when a country goes to war with itself. Secondly, how does American involvement change from 45 up to 68? Thirdly, you should think about how the communist forces, both the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese army, fight, and you should be able to compare that to the tactics of the Americans. And finally, you want to be thinking about, well, what were the key turning points in the war up until 1968? So those are the 4 areas I would have you think about in this section, and I would break down your revision by those 4 sections. So number 1, let's just quickly go through those key turning points. You've got to know about the Battle of Dien Bien Phu, and it's something that is often sort of passed over or forgotten about by students. Actually, that is the end of the French in Vietnam. It's that battle which they lose. They're defeated by the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, and this failure of the French forces them out and leads to the Geneva Agreement, in which Vietnam is divided into 2, which is the essence of the problem, just like with Korea, similar. You've got to be able to talk about the Gulf of Tonkin, because the Gulf of Tonkin is the incident that gets the Americans into Vietnam. You know, Lyndon Baines Johnson looking for a reason to go to war, and he finds it in this incident. You've got to know about the Tet Offensive, because the Tet Offensive at the beginning of January 1968 reveals to the American public that they are not winning this war, despite the fact that that is what they've been told. And in fact, the communist forces remain very strong. So it's worth knowing about that one. I would also know about My Lai, which is this dreadful massacre of US troops, which takes place after the Tet Offensive and then is discovered later on. And again, it's revealing of some of this very important, you know, the kind of collapse in morale and this terrible behaviour by American troops. Right, so now we've talked about some of those key turning points which you might need to describe. And again, I haven't given a lot of detail, but those are things you can go and find out more about. How did French rule lead to civil war and therefore a divided country? Well, what have we got there? So remember, the French called this Indochina. It was a colony of theirs. Before the Second World War, Japan invades and takes control of it, but the French want it back after the Second World War. Because it's helped make the French wealthy through trade. Now, the Vietnamese, having already fought a guerrilla warfare against the Japanese with the Viet Minh, led by Ho Chi Minh, they then, having defeated the Japanese, or helped defeat the Japanese, helped fight the Japanese during the Second World War, they then turn their attention to the French because they want Vietnam to be ruled by Vietnamese. And this is often called the First Indochina War. So from 45 up until 54, this Viet Minh are fighting against the French. Now, again, we talked about China earlier on. China, when it becomes a communist country in 1949, supports the Viet Minh, and the Americans then, fearful of the spread of communism and the so-called domino effect, fund the French. And so Truman is giving money to the French in order to try to have them fight the Viet Minh. The Viet Minh are very powerful in the rural areas of Vietnam, whereas the French tend to control the cities, and they use these guerrilla hit-and-run tactics using their environment very effectively against the French, in the same way that the Viet Cong or the NLF will use against the Americans later on. So the French might have the superior equipment, just like the Americans, but the nature of warfare the French really struggle with, just as the Americans will later on. Ultimately, they lose this battle, this very famous battle, Dien Bien Phu, and it's a huge humiliation to the French, and they withdraw, and what happens as a result is the Geneva Agreement, which divides Vietnam and is supposed to lead to a united Vietnam in the end, but does not, and again comes back to the core of this problem. So why does war break out again after this agreement, and how does the US involvement change over time? Well, war breaks out again because the Geneva Agreement fails fundamentally. Neither the leader of the North, Ho Chi Minh, nor a man called Diem, who's an American stooge, effectively someone or someone who they believe they could control in the South. Neither of these men is happy, just like in Korea, and both would like to rule the whole of it. But Diem, frankly, has very little legitimacy. He was very unpopular amongst many of his own people, not all, but many of his own people. He was a Catholic in a largely Buddhist country. And Buddhists saw their treatment under him, they saw themselves being persecuted, and there was a lot of opposition amongst Buddhists to his rule. And of course, you've also got this what is effectively a sort of evolution from the Viet Minh, which is the National Liberation Front, often gets called the Viet Cong by the Americans. There is a group that represents kind of both the middle classes and the peasants in Vietnam, also who are unhappy with Diem's rule. He is seen as someone who is basically not allowing freedom of speech, giving jobs to his friends, treating the peasants badly, and so he's a very unpopular leader. But the Americans, although they might not like the way he rules, at least he was someone who they could rely on to suit as a capitalist, and they support Diem. Now they knew that Diem couldn't basically survive against these guerrilla attacks, or against the North Vietnamese army without their support. So they fund the ARVN. Now Truman, he sends money and equipment to the French. Eisenhower, later, who follows Truman, he again supports Diem's government with money and supplies, military supplies. And he also is complicit in Diem's basically falsifying or rigging elections. So they're right in there doing anything they can to support Diem, despite the fact that he's a corrupt leader and he's very unpopular. Kennedy continues to do the same, increasing financial support, increasing the number of American military advisors. There are thousands of military advisors there, even before the Americans send troops. And, for example, he supports this very unpopular strategic hamlet program where peasants are moved away from their villages and effectively put in stockades to keep them away from the Viet Cong. All of this makes Diem and his AVRN more unpopular amongst large numbers of people in South Vietnam. Now, Kennedy is assassinated, and Lyndon Baines Johnson, who is his deputy, needs to win an election in a period of time when there's a lot of talk of looking tough on communists in America. And Lyndon Baines Johnson knows that in order to win the election, he's going to have something which makes him look tough on communism, because his Republican opponent is taunting him and saying he's not. And so Vietnam provides him with the opportunity to do that. So what does he do? Well, he orders American ships to be sent into North Vietnamese waters, the so-called Gulf of Tonkin. And this is a pure provocation. And of course, when those ships are shot at, the Americans shoot back, and it becomes the justification to go to war. And Truman goes to Congress, gets an agreement that he can now carry out military activity without having to pass it in America, past Congress any further. So it is a huge turning point. And there's a lot of confusion over this incident, whether American ships were or weren't fired out, or how many times they were. But Lyndon Baines Johnson has found his reason. He needed justification for war, and he's found it. It becomes very controversial, and in fact now it's much harder for American presidents to do this. He starts with his operation, this bombing, which continues for 3 years. It's known as Operation Rolling Thunder. And relatively soon, there are hundreds of thousands of American troops now in Vietnam supporting the ARVN, fighting the North, but also fighting those Viet Cong guerrillas. So what are the tactics they use? Well, the Viet Cong use these so-called guerrilla tactics, these attack and retreat tactics. They know they are not superior in terms of weaponry, so what they can have is the element of surprise using their environment. They don't wear uniforms, and Americans are fighting this as well as a more traditional, if you like, army in the north. So they're fighting two enemies. They are very well supplied with the Ho Chi Minh Trail, which comes down the border of Viet Cong through Cambodia and Laos, and so the Chinese and the Russians are able to supply them through this period. They have a number of tactics, including hanging on the belts of the Americans, so staying close, which made it very difficult or harder for the Americans to use their aerial warfare, because of course then they would end up bombing their own people. They improvise, they use booby traps, They improvised explosive devices. They have tunnels. They use what they have around them, creating sharp sticks called punji sticks. They're placing traps for the Americans to fall into. So generally, they're not trying to win battles face to face in a traditional way. They're trying to wear down the enemy in a war of attrition. Now, the Tet Offensive is the one area that's the change to that, because then, beginning in 1968, they go for an all-out attack on South Vietnamese cities, including the American embassy. Now, it doesn't succeed. The Americans win back everything they attack, but it shows that after 3 years of fighting, the Americans are nowhere near winning. The Americans rely on their superior technology and a much more heavy-handed approach. So they will carry out extensive bombing, huge, flattening the large parts of Vietnam. But they need to find the enemy, and the enemy is very difficult to find, so they have to go out on patrols, these search and destroy patrols. But these are very dangerous and they're very morale sapping. And they also make them very unpopular amongst the people, because they're going in, they're often burning these villages, they get frustrated because they don't know where the enemy is. And the other thing that makes the Americans very unpopular is the use of chemical warfare. So Agent Orange and Agent Blue to destroy crops and trees, and the use of napalm, which causes terrible injuries. And these not only make the Americans unpopular in Vietnam, but their use and the fact that this is seen around the world really turns public opinion against this war outside of Vietnam. So the last section that you would definitely want to think about, because you're very likely you get questions across all three sections. So the last question is really the bit where America tries to get out of this war and what the consequences were. So it's from 68 to 75. The first question you want to consider is, what is Nixon's strategy? Nixon is the president after LBJ. How is he going to try and get out of this war? We would want to consider here the opposition movement. Really important. This is a very, very important opposition movement in America. How significant is it? You'd want to think about, well, why is it the American fails here in a way that it could be argued it did not fail in Korea, but it has failed here? Why? And then ultimately, what are the consequences of the war? A bit like Korea, you want to think about that. So let's talk about Nixon and his plan to get out of the war. He promises he will come out of this war, and he promises so-called peace with honour. So how does he intend to achieve it? Well, his major plan is not wildly complicated. It's effectively spending so much money and providing so much advanced equipment and training for the South Vietnamese that they can fight by themselves. This is called Vietnamization. At the same time, he's going to reduce the levels of American support. That is his plan, and a huge amount of money and effort is spent on trying to improve the ARVN. At the same time, he actually widens the war earlier on. He widens American activities into Cambodia and Laos, where there are communist movements growing there, and he sees them as being supportive of the North Vietnamese. And so his intention is to do as much damage as possible in order that it will make the ARVN's job easier. There is also an attempt to negotiate with the North, and he encourages the South Vietnamese to become involved in this negotiation as well. So it's partly negotiation and partly military action. It's carrot and stick, if you like. Now, he wants peace with honour. He wants to get US troops home, but he doesn't want the South to fall, because then all of this money, all of these American lives lost, what would have been worth it when he promises peace with honour? So this is his plan. Now, at the same time, there is, a significant and growing protest movement. Now, I'm going to go back a bit, because this didn't start under Nixon. So bear in mind, this protest movement is there right from the very beginning of Americans' involvement in this war. So from 64 into 65, people are already saying this is not a war America should be involved in. Why does this become such an issue? Well, the role of the media in the Vietnam War cannot be overstated. They often call this the first television war, because There are thousands of reporters, American reporters, and technology means that they are now able to get back their stories, whether they're newspaper stories or television stories, very, very rapidly via satellite. So news can be made and consumed very quickly, and the Americans can really see what's going on. And actually, because this was new technology, the American government probably didn't apply the kind of levels of censorship that it might do in later stages. So you get a lot of real reporting going on where people are able to see exactly what's happening, and they're able to see the problems the Americans are facing. Most people now in America have television and colour television, and they can see this stuff in their living rooms. The failures of the Americans become very obvious, both in terms of the tactical failures, but also in terms of the fact that the morale of these soldiers is pretty low. There are television images every week of American soldiers being brought back in coffins. And at the same time, there doesn't appear to be any end to this war. Remember, many young people they're the people drafted in. The average age is 19. The average age of a casualty is 23. So these are very young people being drafted and sent. And so young people react against that. And there's a big movement, particularly amongst the universities, a protest movement. Many people object to it because of the cost of the war. Lyndon Baines Johnson had promised a renewed contract with the people, where this big society where money was going to be poured into in making better great, and yet billions of dollars was poured into a war thousands of miles from America. And other groups that had a legitimate reason to be very angry were, for example, African Americans, who were more likely than their white counterparts to be drafted into this war, and yet, of course, faced terrible discrimination in the 1960s themselves, and they were very prominent opposition African American leaders like Martin Luther King, but also Muhammad Ali, of course. So it's also worth considering why the Americans lost the war. So there are a number of things to think about if you're revising this. The first one is that the American tactics clearly failed, so they relied on superior weaponry, particularly aerial power, but ultimately those tactics weren't able to defeat a very, very successful communist forces. On the one hand, you had the Viet Cong, or the NLF, using guerrilla tactics very, very effectively, and on the other hand, you had a more conventional army in the north, and these were both well supplied with weapons and support from China and the Soviet Union. The third thing to consider is that American troops suffered from a real low morale and a kind of a lack of desire to be there. Remember, this was thousands of kilometres away from their own country. They often only did a tour of duty for a year. They were very young. They were drafted, and for many, they lacked the motivation. Whereas, of course, the absolute reverse was true for many of them fighting on the communist side, because they were fighting in their own country for their own future. And the lack of the differences in experience of fighting also really counted, putting the relative lack of experience amongst the Americans, as opposed to, in many cases, many years of experience. Of course, the other thing to bear in mind is that in the end, the war became more and more unpopular in America, and therefore it was important that American presidents, from Johnson really onwards, but certainly Nixon, got out of this war as soon as they possibly could. Whereas actually there was fairly significant support amongst the people of Vietnam for the communist forces. Not entirely, some didn't, but more support. And the Americans really failed to win over the hearts and minds of the people in Vietnam, whereas the communist forces were much better at doing that. So the last section then is all about consequences of the war. So again, when you're revising it and you're breaking it down into these parts, try to think about maybe the kind of bullet points that I'm putting here as well. So one of the consequences was the social consequences, which are always enormous for war, and that was certainly the case here. Remember, this war had been raging since 1945, came to an end in 1975, and so millions of casualties from Vietnam. The Americans have been fighting since 65. So 1 million Vietnamese soldiers and 2 million civilians killed. 60,000 American soldiers, although a much smaller number. The impact that seeing those young men losing their lives in America was enormous. And on top of that, huge refugee crisis as people were forced to flee their homes, and the accompanying drug and alcohol addiction both amongst American soldiers and Vietnamese civilians because of the problems they'd seen. There was also problems, for example, with children born to their fathers were American servicemen who just left, and there was many thousands of children who were really sort of outcast because of the fact they'd been abandoned by their fathers, and they were seen as the children of the enemy in some sense. There was an enormous environmental cost to Vietnam as well, with thousands and thousands of tons of unexploded bombs, as well as the bombs that did explode and cause untold destruction to the environment. And of course, the widespread use of chemicals also had a very detrimental impact on the environment for a very long time, and these chemicals were cancer causing as well. And there's also a political outcome here, because politically speaking, this sort of really undermined trust in American politicians, because there was a strong sense that there'd been promises made that this would be an easy victory, and it turned out that wasn't the case. And so that really began to undermine people's trust in politicians, particularly since the role of the media in that. And this humiliation for America, which it really was, in the end, is one of the reasons they're forced, or they look to building better relationships with communist powers. And not least, of course, the cost was absolutely vast, and there's no way America or the Soviet Union really wanted to continue spending so much money, so much of their GDP on weaponry. This, in modern terms, would have cost the Americans about $1 trillion, an extraordinary amount of money.